Welcome back to Writing 150, and today we're going to talk about pre-writing. We're going to talk about some different strategies you might use to flesh out your ideas before you actually get started drafting. So let's get started. So here's what I'd like you to think about as I am going through this PowerPoint today. I want you to consider what pre-writing strategies you might try or retry to make your writing projects in this class as good as you possibly can, and what pre-writing strategies might you hang on to that you might want to use in the future, either in your classes at GVSU or in the future once you've graduated. So for many of you, you've probably heard of pre-writing before, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, pre-writing is any thinking, talking, reading, or writing that goes on prior to goal-oriented drafting. So a lot of people think that pre-writing is just writing, but I think you'll see through this PowerPoint that there's actually a lot more to pre-writing than just the writing itself. Remember that I told you that Writing 150 is based on a process model of writing. So pre-writing is the first stage in that process. It's the stage where you're coming up with ideas and you're fleshing out the ideas enough so that you can decide whether those are actually ideas you want to pursue in a full draft. It's not unusual to spend a lot of time in pre-writing. And that makes sense, right? Because if you think about it, you want to be fairly certain that the idea you use for your draft is actually the idea you want to write about. Also, you need to have enough ideas so that when you start your drafting process, you don't get stuck halfway through. Many writers spend about half their time on the pre-writing stage, and then they return to it through the drafting and revising process. In other words, you don't do all your pre-writing right at the beginning. Sometimes you have to do some of your pre-writing as you're actually writing your draft. So a good goal for you in this class is to spend 1/4 of your time on pre-writing. So think about when your essay is due, count back to today, and figure out how many days you might want to spend just doing pre-writing on this paper. So there are many components to pre-writing, and remember that one of them is thinking. Committed writers think about their writing projects at all hours of the day or night. Have you ever had the experience of coming up with an idea and then letting that idea sit for a couple of days, and after a couple of days of percolating in your mind, suddenly you have great ideas about what you might want to add to your paper? That's because sometimes just letting an idea sort of ferment in your brain, just letting yourself think about it for a while, is very important to the writing process. That's why we came up with ideas on the first day of class, but I didn't have you commit to your ideas on the first day of class, because I wanted to give you time to actually think. Talking is also an important part of the writing process. You might try telling people about your topic, talking it through, practicing explaining it, and see what questions come up. You might ask others about their projects. You might talk to me, or a supervisor or an editor in a different situation. You can ask me if I think that your topic idea is on the right track, and you might also ask me for other ideas on ways to expand your topic, and I'm happy to help you with those. Reading is also an important part of the pre-writing process. If you, for example, were writing a paper about a topic that was related to one of your other courses, you might try looking in the back of your course textbooks and looking at the index. Sometimes looking at the index of a course-related book can really help you not just come up with ideas, but find additional information on ideas that you're writing about. Don't discount the usefulness of your other courses as you're working on your papers in Writing 150. You might also try using Wikipedia in order to get a base understanding of the topic you're working on. A lot of students have been told in high school that Wikipedia is not a strong source for a research paper. We'll talk more about this later in the semester, but Wikipedia is actually a great place for you to get some basic ideas about your topic. So don't be afraid to start with Wikipedia just to read and learn. Another important reading strategy for pre-writing is to look at a model for your paper. In other words, what does a successful paper in this genre or this type of writing look like? We'll look at a model of your first assignment in class, but remember that I also pointed out several other models that you might want to look at on the assignment sheet for Essay 1. Writing is perhaps the most obvious form of pre-writing, but there are many types of writing that can be considered pre-writing. Especially for your first essay, generating data will be very important. The specific kind of data that we're going to be generating in Essay 1 is field research. And by field research, I really mean observations and interviews. Before you start drafting your essay in earnest, you will want to do some basic field research. You may want to visit a site related to your topic, and you may want to begin doing some interviews with people who are already very much committed to your topic or involved in your topic in some way. If you do this first, you'll have plenty of data and material to draw on as you continue your pre-writing process and later your drafting. Before you begin writing, you might prepare an annotated bibliography, which truly is just a fancy way of saying you might take some notes from resources and research that you've come across as you've been reading. It's a very good idea as you are doing some basic research for your essay, research that you think you might want to include in your essay, to take notes and to include the citation if you can, or at least some idea of where you got your material, as well as including any quotes or paraphrases you might later want to include in your paper. Make sure that if there's a particular quote that stands out to you as you're doing some preliminary research and you think you might want to include it in your paper, that you take very careful notes and put the quote in quotation marks and attribute it to your source in your notes, because it's too easy later on as you're drafting to forget what's a quotation and what's a paraphrase and what's from your own mind if you're taking notes and you're not careful. This is what some notes from research might look like. Notice there's a citation at the top, so it's very clear where all of this material came from. Notice there are quotations in quotation marks. Notice there are page numbers, and notice that there are a few just sort of notations for the author himself. So, for example, see that second line where it says good for framing section and rhetoric of love section? That's the author's notes to himself. I might want to include this in my paper in this section. Now, I'll tell you the truth. When I was in school, I never really did this. I never really bothered to take notes from my sources as I was researching. I always just try to keep all the research in my mind, and then later when I was actually drafting, I'd go back and try to find it all and add it to my paper. It wasn't until I was in graduate school that I started actually taking notes from my research as I researched, and then using that to draft my essays. I will tell you honestly that even though as an undergrad I thought it was a big waste of time to do this, as a graduate student I realized it would have saved me so much time to take notes as I went along. I really can't encourage you enough to make sure that you're taking notes in the preliminary phases of your research, rather than having to dig through all of the research you've done when the time comes to actually write your paper. This will be something that will be so beneficial to you if you begin the habit now, early in undergrad, rather than waiting until your senior year. By that time, you'll have wasted so much time just digging through old research that you've read a million times before, trying to find that one quote that really stood out to you. The method that you use for taking notes doesn't really matter, as long as you're careful to make sure that you're attributing quotes to their original authors. Finally, we get to some pre-writing strategies that may be familiar to you. At some point during the semester, I will give you the opportunity to try each of these free-writing strategies at least once. Try to remember which ones have worked well for you so that you can bring them to courses in the future and apply them. The first strategy is free writing. This is perhaps the most commonly used pre-writing strategy. Basically, you're just writing without worrying about any kind of finished product. It's sort of like you're thinking on paper. Sometimes it can be more productive than just thinking because you can keep a record of your thinking. And also, I've found that sometimes just the act of writing on paper, even if all I'm writing is I don't know what to say, helps me to generate ideas. The second strategy is looping. Basically, in this strategy, you write without worrying about any kind of finished product for about 5 minutes. After 5 minutes, you read over what you've written. You choose the most interesting idea you came up with in the previous 5 minutes, and you write for another 5 minutes using that interesting idea as your starting point. You repeat it as many times as you can or as you need to in order to come to a more clear understanding of your topic or come up with a more interesting idea. Cubing is one of my favorite strategies. Basically, it gives you 6 perspectives from which to think about a topic. How might you describe your topic? What might you compare it to? How might you talk about it to a friend? What are its component parts? What might you be able to use it to do? And finally, how might you argue for or against it? Mapping, also called clustering, is a form of pre-writing that many of my students have encountered before. And then outlining, one of the oldest forms of pre-writing. In this form of pre-writing, you create a sentence outline of your ideas, and it gives you some sense of the structure that you might want to use for your paper. But often what happens is when you start writing, you realize another structure or slight tweaks to your outline become necessary, and that's fine. Remember that when you create an outline before you begin writing, that outline is always tentative and open to change. The nice thing about an outline, though, is if you're the type of person who has trouble sustaining a draft, it does give you a roadmap which you can follow until you get your footing. Journaling is another kind of pre-writing. Basically, you keep a journal throughout the course of your writing project. By doing entries every couple of days, you are able to keep track of your thoughts and also the research that you've been doing, any dead ends you run into, and any questions you have throughout the course of the project. Another form of writing that can be used as pre-writing is to do an audience analysis. You can think about your reader and try to figure out, for example, what they already know about the topic or what you want them to learn from the topic. It's a really nice way to help you decide what your purpose is when it comes to writing your draft. You could also try writing an email or a letter to your audience, although, of course, you wouldn't send it. This is just a way for you to get your thoughts out on paper again and try to figure out what the key aspects of your writing are that you really want your audience to understand. You could write to a smart friend, and this you actually could send. You want to choose somebody who will understand your topic and also will respond to your material. You could tell them why you're interested in your topic, tell them why you think they should be interested in your topic, tell you what's worrying about your writing project and how you'll try to overcome your worries. Try to explain your main points in a single paragraph. Sometimes explaining your topic can be useful in clarifying your thoughts. So in conclusion, Prewriting is really more than you might think. There are 4 different ways that you can actually do prewriting. You can think about your topic, and basically this is just quiet time you're using to yourself in order to let that idea percolate. You can talk about your topic both with experts in the field, with your classmates, with your teacher, and with other people who you think might have similar perspectives to your intended audience. You can read and do research on your topic to make sure that you understand and have enough information in order to actually sustain a draft. And then finally, you can do some pre-writing, literal writing, using the strategies that I've outlined. So at this point, you should have plenty of ideas about different ways that you might be interested in pre-writing for your first assignment. And now that I've talked to you a little bit about pre-writing, I'd like to give you a pre-writing assignment. So why don't you check it out on Blackboard and let me know if you have any questions. Take care. Happy pre-writing.